careless. They're all over the internet these days. So instead of going the usual S to F, I decided to shake it up a little with very serious to absolute shitpost. What better to start it out with than the Beatles' self-titled album from 1968, also known as the White Album. For those who don't know, the Beatles were a four-man boy band from the 1960s comprising of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, and George Harrison. The Beatles are best known for their Beatles Funny Interviews YouTube video. The Beatles' self-titled album, also known as the White Album, was released in 1968 as a two-record big boy album. That means there's lots of room for absolutely silly stuff that shouldn't have existed, but it does. Let's get right into it. But first, you aren't subscribed. Hit that freaking button. Let's get to 50 subscribers by next year. I believe in us. Let's do this. Let's start out with the first track on the album, Back in the U.S.S.R. By my standards, it's quite a good album opener with the way it builds up. However, it does not waste time. It builds up quick and builds up fast. Back in the U.S.S.R. I would consider a little silly, just because of its whole context of going back to the Soviet Union, which is not somewhere where anyone in the band is actually from. The second track, Dear Prudence, I would consider quite serious, because it's not all that silly for White Album standards, if I'm being quite honest. Next up is the track Glass Onion, in which John Lennon states that Paul McCartney had been, in fact, the walrus all along. We know that to be false. I'm putting Glass Onion in the really silly category. Next up, I would consider the tone of the track Obla Di Obla Da quite silly, personally, as it's got that kind of upbeat on the keyboard, and it kind of mixes them up a little, shifts them up. You know, I don't know. I put it there. Make me not, okay? I'm going on to the next one. This is dumb. Next up, we have the track Wild Honey Pie. Not to be mistaken with the absolute bop that is the song Honey Pie. Wild Honey Pie I would dump in the absolute shitpost category. The only lyrics being Honey Pie, repeated with a twanging guitar in the background. This I would consider, by 1960s standards, to be quite the shitpost. Why did the Beatles include it on their album? Because they could. What are you gonna do? Go back and stop them? You can't. That's right. I told you. Next up we have the continuing story of Bungalow Bill, in which Bungalow Bill hunts for tigers with his elephant. As one could tell, the lyrical content of this track is quite silly. I would place it in the really silly category. Not quite shitpost here, as there is some story content to it. However, it is close. Next up we have the track While My Guitar Gently Weeps, which is in fact a George Harrison classic. I've put that in the very serious category because I very seriously like this track. Happiness is a Warm Gun had me quite torn on where to place it. On one hand, the chorus was quite silly with happiness is a warm gun, bang bang, shoot shoot, but also, it starts out as quite the bop. So I placed it in the really silly category. It's not quite a shitpost, but just like the previous tracks I've placed in that category, they're getting pretty close. Next up, Martha My Dear. I would consider this to be a little silly, as the tuba in the background really gets me going a little bit. It gets me in the silly mood, right? That's about it. The only reason. Stop me. Next up, we have the track I'm So Tired, which is, in my opinion, such a John Lennon song. I have placed it in a little silly, as, in my opinion, the progression gets a little goofy. Next, Blackbird, I have placed in the very serious category, as its lyrical content and meaning is not very silly, in my opinion. Next up we have Piggies, quite the interesting track, in which it states, everywhere there are little piggies, with their piggy wives, clutching forks and knives to eat their bacon, which is quite perplexing, as it does involve the subject of pig cannibalism. However, if we look at it a purely silly standpoint, I would put it in the really silly category. It is quite strange, though. Next we have Racoon, a story of a simp who tries to shoot the boyfriend of the e-girl he was chasing, only to be shot himself. Ultimately, though quite torn on where to place it, I decided to place this track in the silly category, as the story is quite silly. However, it's not quite silly enough for really silly, as it does have very important consequences. Simps must remember to not go after the boyfriend of the e-girl. They are not yours, and you should not try to shoot them. Not good. Next we have Don't Pass Me By. I have placed this track in a little silly category, as I think Ringo's pretty silly. I am quite perplexed at the origin of Why Don't We Do It in the Road. This song was written by Paul McCartney after witnessing two monkeys having at it in the middle of a road. Why would he write this song? Why does it exist? I can't tell you. The song does state, why don't we do it in the road? No one will be watching us, why don't we do it in the road? The problem with that statement is, you will absolutely be seen if you do such a thing in a public place. Please do not take the advice of Paul McCartney on this track. I always forget which song I Will is. However, I do admit it is quite the bop. I've placed it in a little silly, because although the song is serious in lyrical content, I cannot take it completely seriously with the boops and bops in the background. Julia is the next track. This was written by John Lennon about his deceased mother. I'm placing this in very serious. After that track, we get to the second disc, or record, or side C, or whatever you want to call it. Birthday is quite the silly tune, in which they say it's your birthday. It's my birthday too, yeah. You say it's your birthday. It's my birthday too, yeah. The next track is titled Yer Blues. I always forget the title of this one, and sometimes I even forget that it is in fact a Beatles song and not something that John Lennon had done on his own. I've placed it in the very serious category because it does deal with some instances of wanting to die. It is a total bop though, so I do recommend listening to it after this video. The next track is Mother Nature's Son. I always forget about this one because it's not really one of my favorites, and I don't dislike it. I've decided to place it in a little silly because I thought that when I made this list. Honestly, quite the forgettable track. Next up we've got Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey. Another monkey-related song that is quite silly in my opinion. I'd place it in the absolute shitpost category if it weren't for the fact that the beat absolutely slaps. Next up, Sexy Sadie. What have you done? You've made a fool of everyone. This is quite serious. Why did you do that? Next after that, we have the absolute bop that is the track Helter Skelter. I would consider this to be quite silly. As a side note, a cult has used Helter Skelter as their excuse to incite a race war. I will leave a link in the description below for you to read more. Next we have Long, 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 a track in which I think is too long. I personally would not put Long, Long, Long on any list of my favorite songs. However, I would not consider the track Long, Long, Long to be quite silly, so I've placed it in the serious category. Revolution 1 I would place in a little silly. As a side note, the single version, Revolution, is like this, but objectively better. I will leave a link to it in the description below. The beat of the song Honey Pie made me feel a little silly, so I decided to place it in the silly category. That's where it is. Up next we have Savory Truffle. I would place this in the really silly category. I've placed Cry Baby Cry in a little silly, as it is a little silly. Revolution 9 has been placed in my absolute shitpost category, as this track is a almost 9-minute shitpost. And for the last track, Good Night, a song in which Ringo Starr wishes you a good night, I have placed in the silly category because I think that Ringo Starr is quite silly. That's it for my tier list. Be sure to hit that red button below or else I will come over there and break your kneecaps. I'll see you next time. I'm going to leave now. Why are you still here? Go. Skedaddle. Click this. Why are you... The end card's over. Get out of here.